everyone. I'm very happy that you're here. Those of you who are joining us in person, and those of you who are joining us online. Today, you're going to hear a book presentation by Walter Kemp, a book that he published in the Routledge New Diplomacy Studies series, Security Through Cooperation to the Same End. And if I understand correctly, you do have, so Walter has some copies over there, and after
special
the
price
talk,
today.
if you and after the talk, so you can get some of them. As a way of quickly introducing it, so I don't know, 10 years ago or so, I started this book series with a friend of mine, and we get quite a few proposals, and most of those proposals they're not going to lead anywhere actually. With Walter, it was very, very different from the get-go. So we were very enthusiastic about the project. The people at Routledge were very enthusiastic about the project, and it was really extraordinarily smooth sailing. It was very easy. Now, why would that be? Looking at the book, I could think of 3 reasons for that. The first one, Walter asks really big questions. The one I like the most, and I quote, "Why is the world in such a mess?" Bear in mind, he wrote this book manuscript, and the book was published before the Ukraine. Yeah, so before the Ukraine, there was already quite a bit of a mess, so we have to talk about that too. Obviously, the world is in even more of a mess now, and so I think because of that, the book is actually all the more important. I think the second reason why everything was very smooth sailing, why it really became a great book, is that he develops a crystal clear argument. Basically, very simply put, he says it's in the enlightened self-interest of states to cooperate. And if they do this cooperation, then they will be secure. He applies this to a range of threat scenarios, traditional security threats, countering international crime, cyber threats, so to a much larger scope of threats and challenges than most books do. There's also a lot about cooperation, confidence, and trust building in there, which, by the way, may become quite important a little further east once things hopefully have calmed down. And the third reason why it's definitely a book worth to be read, very worth to be read, is because of the wealth of empirical knowledge that it contains. So there is a rigorous conceptualization of cooperation, everything, so the way how one would want to have that as a scholar. So there is something about Robert Axelrod and tit for tat and all of that. But in between the lines, you can always read Walter. And Walter has a lot of practical experience at the UNODC, at the OSCE, the International Peace Institute, the Cooperative Security Initiative, the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, which he currently directs. So it's definitely there's a lot of empirical knowledge in there. And we thought about how we're going to do this. So the two of us have been on panels on numerous occasions in different countries. One was, I remember that actually, especially now today in St. Petersburg, right? It was really great. Things look different now, but anyway. And we're going to do this in quite an interactive format. So he's going to talk for about 20 minutes. Then we'll enter a discussion, a chat, if you want to put it that way, for 20 minutes. And then we're going to open up, and then we have about 20 minutes, or even more if you want to, for questions and answers. Okay? So first of all, great welcome to you, Walter. Thanks a lot for being here. And without any further ado, you have the word.
Thanks very much, Markus, and thanks to all of you for coming. I wasn't sure how many people might want to come to a talk on cooperative security these days. I'm not sure if this is the best of times or the worst of times to have just written a book about security through cooperation. Somebody said to me the other day, I think it was a joke, but that they ordered the book in January and they were wondering now if they could have their money back. That's not an option. For those of you who are interested, there are copies over there. And I have to say, with due respect to Rutledge, and Markus has a connection to the series, it could have been slightly bigger in the font and slightly smaller in the price. But nevertheless, special price today for those of you who would like to have a copy. I think, based on the current situation that we're in, and we can discuss this later, but this is probably not a good time for cooperation. I think that's quite evident. But the book talks about lessons learned from trying to build cooperation in the past, and the situation that we see today is what happens when cooperation fails, and we can talk about why that happened. At the same time, and this is my hope and my inspiration for why I wrote the book, is that I think that if we're going to deal with our problems for the future, the emerging threats and challenges that we can see in the world, that they can only be resolved by working together. That even the most powerful countries in the world are going to have to work with other countries to deal with what Kofi Annan called problems without passports. Things that go across borders, which no state on its own can control: cyber threats, terrorism, organized crime, pandemics, and so on. My argument, as Markus said, is actually not some kind of fuzzy liberal approach to international order. It's more based on realpolitik, that countries have a self-interest to work together. Also, the logic, and this is very much reflected in the cover, and I always judge a book by its cover, is that countries need to work together in an interdependent and an interlinked world. I think we can see that very much in this current crisis. Perhaps we're in the beginning of a process of deglobalization. You can see now Western Europe trying to decouple itself from Russia in terms of energy, and perhaps vice versa. But at the moment, we live in a very interconnected world. Conversely, if we don't cooperate, we'll all reach the same end. And that's the rather negative connotation of the subtitle, Security Through Cooperation to the Same End. The definition of cooperation is to work together to the same end, but if we don't cooperate, we're all going to have the same end, which could be our end as a species, frankly. The book was inspired by a number of factors. The first was that I was teaching a course here on organized crime, and I said to Markus, is there a course on cooperation and trust? And he said no, and I thought that's a little bit strange for a diplomatic academy. It's kind of a basic thing that you need to develop if you're going to be a diplomat or in the private sector. So we decided that we would develop this course on cooperation and trust, I think 3 or 4 years ago. Then I realized there's no textbook. So I started developing lectures, and this is actually very much the outcome of the 6 lectures that I have done here, which is why I was able to write it relatively quickly. You could say then that this is very much kind of made in the DA product. It was inspired by the Diplomatic Academy, and that's why it makes me very proud to launch it here today. Another inspiration is the fact that for the last 25 to 30 years, I've been working on issues of security and cooperation in Europe, particularly in the OSCE. And in the last few years working in the OSCE, I was becoming quite frustrated at how it was clear that the vision of 1990, the Charter of Paris of a Europe whole and free, undivided and at peace, was starting to unravel. So the Europe that I grew up in and saw, the end of the Cold War, the end of the Berlin Wall, thinking not that this was the end of history, but a better and brighter future was coming to an end. Why was that happening? What could we do about it? The other was the frustration at the international system not being able to deal with the threats and challenges that were clearly either present or on the horizon, not least with the problems with migration in 2015. And thinking, on the one hand, the world is coming apart, and on the other hand, it's, falling apart and coming together at the same time. And what does that mean? And why is it that precisely at the time when we need international cooperation, states are going it alone, having this kind of do-it-themselves approach to international security. Another more personal inspiration was when I came to Austria a few years ago. I had never lived in a village before, and I now live in a village just outside of Klosterneuburg. And we built a house, and another neighbor just behind us had built a house. And he has rather young children, whereas we had infants. The first line in this book is, tell them to turn down the music or I'll call the police. My wife was one evening very upset at the music coming from next door. I went over, said, can you please turn down the music, and so on. Next night, the music was loud again. This went on for several days. One day in the morning, there were eggs splattered all over the side of their house. It wasn't me. Obviously, there were other people that didn't like this. After that, they had the music turned down. But a similar experience, one day on a Sunday, I was mowing my lawn, and a neighbor came running across the street, a different neighbor, and he said, in a rather typically Austrian way, it doesn't bother me that you're mowing your grass on a Sunday afternoon, but there are rules in Austria about when you can mow your grass. And I must have looked rather skeptical, because in Canada you can mow your lawn anytime. He came back 10 minutes later with a piece of paper with the rules saying when you can mow your lawn, and sure enough, on a Sunday, it's not allowed. After that, I followed the rules, and we had good neighborly relations. So I think I wanted to scale up my experiences from living in a village to living in the global village. One of the basic messages of the book being that you can't choose your neighbors. You're stuck with them, and you have to find a way to get along. Allow me to give you a brief overview of the book and some of the highlights without giving too much away, because I do hope you will want to look at the book. But it starts by making the argument as to why it's in the self-interest of states to cooperate. It looks at evolution, it looks at game theory, and also philosophy, and looks at how our species actually got to this point. One reason being that within small groups, at least, there was a rationale for animals and human beings to work together. Because if there wasn't, we would all not be here. So something must have worked. And you might think, well, okay, but what about the survival of the strongest and the fittest and the alpha males and so on? One thing that I found most interesting looking at evolution in animals and peoples is very often the violent alpha males in a group were ostracized or kicked out, even killed by the group, because they created a threat to security within the group or outside the group. And if you look later at the evolution of the international system, countries that disturbed that balance of power, that rocked the system, were somehow isolated through sanctions, through being kicked out of organizations like the G8 and so on. And you can see how that's happening today. The second chapter looks at cooperation within states, and this was very much inspired by my time in the Office of the High Commissioner on National Minorities. How can you actually promote cooperation in multi-ethnic states, or countries where you have a part of the country which has a high degree of self-government? Chapter 3 looks at cooperation between states and why it's so difficult, particularly because of the security dilemma. The security dilemma is if there's one country that tries to strengthen its security at the expense of another, it actually has the opposite effect. It makes that other country feel more unstable, which increases a kind of tit-for-tat arms race, as we see in Europe at the moment, both between Ukraine and Russia, but between Russia and the West. It explains the difference between collective security, cooperative security, and common security, and also how cooperative security works in practice. And we have a good example here in Vienna with the OSCE, although I would argue in the last few years it hasn't worked particularly well. Chapter 4 focuses on how cooperation can actually be learned, that you can develop confidence and security building measures of different types, cultural, economic, social, military, and how you can implement those. And as Markus mentioned, at some point, we're going to have, again, a process of rebuilding trust, confidence, and dialogue between Russia and the West. Chapter 5 looks at cooperation among states within the international system. And again, in this twist on the theory of realism, it argues that it's actually in the self-interest of states to work together. This is not because of liberal internationalism. It's because countries realize that if they don't work together, as Hobbes said, life is going to be nasty, brutish, and short in the international system. And they discovered this by trial and error. They realized through self-interest that within at least small coalitions, they would have to work together, particularly if they're small countries. If you look back to the development of what we now regard as the international system, it's actually a relatively recent development. It's from the mid-19th century, when the first international conferences were to do with controlling diseases, like cholera and yellow fever and so on. This then developed into developing an international telegraph union, postal union, all very functional, practical things because states were coming closer together, the world was becoming increasingly interlinked, and they discovered the need to have common aviation rules, common cooperation for laying of cables across the oceans, etc. This was reinforced even more after the Second World War. The UN Charter was written by countries that had just experienced war and wanted to make sure this didn't happen again. Remember the preamble that says that we are doing this to save future generations from the scourge of war, which is why it's so frustrating today that the UN is actually not doing that. But that was the reason, self-interest, enlightened self-interest among countries to work together as an international system. It's worth recalling that the last 3 times that the international system was reformed was after a war. 1815 here in Vienna, the Congress of Vienna, 1919 at Versailles, 1945. And what I said in this book, which I finished writing last autumn, is that it shouldn't take a war to reform the system again. Unfortunately, I thought it might be COVID that would be the trigger to reform the system. Maybe this current conflict, this crisis, which is the biggest disruption of the international system since 1945, might have a silver lining. Even if it doesn't, we're going to have to find a way to get along, because in a nuclear age, the stakes are much higher. The last chapter, which for me was the most interesting to write, was to look at the future of cooperation. What might happen, what can be done to deal with common threats and challenges, particularly those, as Kofi Annan said, the kind of problems without passports. It talks about how to develop a culture of cooperation. It looks at how we need to change the study and teaching of international relations. And my favorite part, because I'm an analog guy in a digital age, is the impact of technology. What could be the impact on artificial intelligence, for example? Could we actually maximize cooperation with algorithms for peace? In the same way that you have dating apps that look at the compatibility of people, will you be able to identify common interests between states by using big data, for example? To summarize, the 3 main takeaways are, first, that this may not look like the best time for cooperation at the moment, but in an interlinked world, at some point, we're going to have to find a way to rebuild the system, to rebuild trust in Europe, but think of other parts of the world as well. Cooperation might seem like a dream at the moment, but it is a necessity, and I think this crisis demonstrates that very well. Second, a word that keeps coming back in the book is reciprocity. And it's interesting that somebody once asked Confucius, what is one word that you could live by? And he said, reciprocity. And if you Google the Golden Rule, you'll see a chart which shows all religions of the world, and all of them have one variation or another of this idea that do unto others as you would have them do to you. And some of these religions developed in different parts of the world around the same time, but didn't necessarily interconnect. So they must have figured out through trial and error that this makes sense. It's actually been demonstrated in a computer program as well called tit for tat, that it makes sense to be to reciprocate in a positive way if somebody starts to cooperate with you. Again, since you can't choose your neighbors, you're going to have to find a way to get along. You might do something wrong to them, you're going to be slapped back and so on. And by the way, cooperation is not appeasement. One of the lines in the book, which is from this computer program, Tit for Tat, is that if somebody slaps you on the cheek, you should slap them back, not like in the Bible where it says turn the other cheek, because otherwise they're going to just keep abusing your goodness, your cooperative spirit, and this is going to undermine any type of security. Third, as I mentioned, the strongest beasts don't always survive. It's the ones that can adapt. It's the ones that can be trusted and work in teams. And if you're interested, there's a nice little BBC documentary called Nice Guys Finish First that shows how in the animal kingdom and also in the world, eventually, it makes sense in the long run to cooperate. To conclude, the world situation may seem daunting at the moment, and one may feel that it's hard to change things for the better, but what's the alternative? I think that this shows that we need to try harder. And if it feels like too big a challenge to change the world, one of my conclusions of the book is to start within your own community. Try and make a difference in the place that you live. With that in mind, and recalling the theme of good neighborly relations, maybe I can finish by reading the epilogue. This is very much inspired by the beginning of the book. I can't do justice to my neighbor's voice. He has a big, booming voice. "Hello, neighbor." The booming voice of my neighbor could be heard through the hedge. "Hello," I called back. "All well?" Yes, but your birch tree, it's much too close to the edge of your property. The branches hang over into my yard. The leaves fall into my swimming pool. And the worst thing is that my bedroom window is at the back here and I'm allergic to the birch tree pollen." There's no English word for schadenfreude, but after all the late nights of blaring music and wild parties, not least when I was trying to write this book, I felt a sweet sense of revenge with my birch tree. But I took a deep breath. "Sure, no problem," I said. "I'll cut the branches that are hanging over your property." "Thanks, Walter, much obliged. You know, I don't want to make a big deal about it. We neighbors need to find a way to get along." "I agree, Hans. By the way, do you read English? I have a book I want to give you." Unfortunately, he doesn't read English, but we are good neighbors. Thanks very much.
Yeah, so no, Walter, thanks a lot. It's you probably got a sense it's actually a very readable, book, much more readable probably than mine. Walter, a few questions. Well, I want to touch upon some of those themes that you've raised, and also go a little bit beyond that. The first one about the enlightened self-interest. Probably, if we ask now anyone in this room or online, then they would probably agree with this notion of an enlightened self-interest. So, most importantly, to extend the time horizon in which you think strategically, and that actually, in the end of the day, everyone is better off cooperating. But these kind of the leaders who we encounter in international politics, and at the moment many of us think about Putin, but there were obviously lots and lots of other ones. They oftentimes tick very differently, right? What are we going to do with these people?
Give them my book. No, one thing that's in the book is that this idea that some of our political theories are not actually set up to deal with the world that we live in. And one is the prisoner's dilemma. I think you all know this theory that if you're in a prison cell, there's somebody else. Do you want to cooperate or do you want to defect? It actually makes sense not to cooperate with the other person. And so people have written books about why you should basically be selfish because the other guy is going to try and screw you. But the thing is, that's not how life works, particularly with countries that are going to interact more than once. And I think if you look at how Trump approached foreign policy, it was as if he was working with real estate in New York, that he would have one transaction, and if he didn't pay, then the guy could sue him, but he didn't care. But as soon as he did this to China, China whacked him back. And he tried to whack China twice as hard, and China whacked him twice as hard. And this is the difference between the prisoner's dilemma, which is one interaction, and the so-called iterated prisoner's dilemma, where you're going to meet each other over time. You don't want to keep whacking each other over time because you're both going to lose in the end. You have an interest to actually try and cooperate if you're going to have more than one transaction with somebody, or at least have some kind of predictability and rules to that relationship. But now what's discouraging is that the rules themselves have been broken by so many countries in the last few years that how do you get back to some kind of rules-based system when there's no global policeman? So, but again, to go back to your question, most leaders that we have today have a very short attention span. They're looking at the next news cycle or the next election. But when it comes to foreign policy, I think the ones that have a longer staying power realize that they need to find a way to get along with their neighbors. And the best example is the rapprochement between France and Germany after the Second World War. If you came back in a time machine from 1944 to today, you wouldn't believe what you see with Macron and Scholz together making common statements. And how that has been the motor for peace in at least Western Europe for the last 70 years.
Mm. And in that case too, I mean, and you alluded to that before, and already there was a big bang before, yeah? So it's this question about learning. So how do actors actually learn? And I used to write that, amongst other things, they learn through positive experience, basically positive big bangs. I'm much more skeptical about this now. It's even in the Germany France case. It's the second. I mean, it's a series of major wars, right? So the kind of cognitive punch being something.
Yeah, you can learn the hard way, and I think Ukraine and Russia are learning that now at their expense and the expense of the international system. That correction is going to take some time. But I think we've been building up to this for a while, and now you keep hearing this German word Wende, that there's some kind of movement, motion, inflection point in the international system. Where we go from here remains to be seen, but we're living in the middle of something big. And it won't be all bad, I have to say.
Let's hope, yeah. You explore a lot of issue areas in the book that other people don't explore. The most interesting one with you, I always find international crime, because that really is very important, underpins lots of conflicts and everything. But if we extend now the conversation about sort of enlightened self-interest to international criminal networks, how are you going to do anything against them? So is it then states and state leaders understanding that they have to do something about them that are going to be really important? Or sometimes you also allude to more of a bottom-up approach in your book. How can we?
There's a book called the Seven Habits of Successful People, something like that. For those of you who've taken my class on organized crime, I make the point that if you were to look at what makes criminal groups successful and what law enforcement should be doing, so effective use of technology, cooperating across borders, being innovators and so on, take that list of 7, the criminals are usually doing everything better than law enforcement. Even this idea that there's inter-ethnic rivalry in, for example, the Balkans, the same people who are arguing at the table are making deals under the table. The criminals always find a way to collude somehow. So how can you actually learn from these kind of relationships, and what can be done at the international level to be much more effectively transnationally? Because the first movers, whenever there's any kind of crisis, are going to be criminal groups. They're always looking for opportunities and seizing them. Whereas the way that we approach dealing with organized crime is very much kind of a 19th century approach, that you're going to protect your own sovereignty, a bit like the sheriff that gallops up to the border, but the bad guys gallop across the border and off into the distance. So the challenge now is to have a much more effective global response to organized crime. But there's no global strategy to deal with it. So that's the thing that we're now focusing on at the Global Initiative, where I'm not the director, by the way. I'm a director, but for the Balkans. But we'll be working now on this global strategy against transnational organized crime.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And last question from me, because I want to have then open things up. Deglobalization. I mean, so that's a concept that we hear now more and more often. How does that tie in? Can you elaborate a little more? How does that tie in with prospects towards a cooperative security? Because there are some people who say, yeah, So less interdependence, even some kind of a splitting of the international system into two blocks. Really pessimistic people saying it's actually going to be even a deeper cut than during the Cold War. How does that affect our prospects to go towards cooperative security?
So I think so much happened so quickly after the end of the Cold War that you had all of these opportunities, but there were almost no filters to deal with them. So you had the movement of people, of money, of illicit activity in a way that was much faster than our ability to regulate it, which was one reason why we had the financial crisis in 2008. I think we're looking now at deglobalization because of things like the pandemic, countries trying to literally build walls and fences, trying to bring back industries to their own countries, realizing that supply chains can be disrupted and affect their own economies, so why are they dependent on a country on the other side of the world? The fact that you have geopolitics then influencing things like financial markets, the situation now with Russia and the West, this whole debate about SWIFT, for example, that I think will be a trend that we see in the next few years, which gets to your point that we're still going to have to find peaceful coexistence between different blocs. So President Biden talks about a kind of community of democracies. Great idea, but more than half of the countries in the world are not democracies, and some of them are pretty big and powerful. So what do? Do we wait for them to be more like us? That's not the trend that we're seeing. Do we just try and keep them away and literally build walls and arm ourselves? I think that's the trend that we're going to see in the next little while. So a lot of talk about deterrence, but not too much talk about detente. But do we then stay behind our walls and just live in literally gated communities within the international system? I think that will be the trend in the short term, but over time is not going to be in people's self-interest unless you have rivalries between these different blocs, which is a bit like in Orwell's 1984, remember, with Europia and Oceania and so on. I would like to think that people will realize that life between 1990 and 2010 was actually pretty good. And the problem with our generation is that we thought that it was going to continue to be like that. And the problem with your generation is that you haven't really seen what it was like beforehand to realize that what we have now is maybe not that much different than what we saw in the 1980s. So I think that people like to travel. They like to see the world. They like the convenience of things moving around quickly, especially in a younger generation. And that interconnectedness, which people have seen, is not something that you're going to be able to put back in the box. And we're seeing this tension now in Russia. Can he really build a firewall around his own system, develop his own internet, his own SWIFT equivalent? Same thing with the Chinese. I think there are too many ways to punch holes in that. And therefore, we will get back to a system of maybe not the kind of globalization, the hyper-globalization that we had in the beginning of the 21st century, but something where we'll be more interconnected and understand the self-interest in working together on things like climate change, like migration, those type of bigger issues, like the pandemic. You can't build walls against this stuff. So you have to cooperate. That's my big takeaway. And it may sound naive, but I think it's even more naive to think that you can have a lot of nuclear weapons and win a nuclear war.
That would definitely be much more naive, yeah. So lots of big questions, and I'm going to hand over to you. And I'm also going to remind the people online that I also have a little device here, so you can also ask questions. But I'll probably first go for the people here in person. Mareike.
Okay, first of all, thank you so much for the talk today. My question would be, what do you think might be new ideas or approaches to encourage people and also state to work together and also deal with threats and challenges? I think you used the term vendor, when I'm not mistaken. Therefore, we have the example in Germany with East and West. Do you, for example, think this might be also a possibility in South and North Korea as well in the future?
Walter, I'm going to gather questions because there usually are quite a few, so I'll do 3 at a time. Yeah.
Thank you. I just want to say I feel for you and your neighbor situation. I also have neighbors that I'm not really fond of, but my cooperation might not work as well as yours. Besides that, you said it's not a good time for cooperation, and I just wonder if you maybe could elaborate. So we see cooperation in the sense of the sanctions, and in the sense that almost the entire world stands together with Ukraine against Russia in all sorts of ways. So I'm just wondering, that seems to me like it's a sort of a cooperation, so that seems to me like it's a good time for cooperation, but then after, whenever it's over, how do we go back to including Russia, or do we go back, or at what point do we go back to including Russia in that cooperation, which has, you know, the foundation in cooperating against in that regime? So that'd be interesting to hear what you have to say.
Thank you. And Julia.
Thank you very much from my part as well. So I just wanted to know, because you mentioned the use of artificial intelligence when it comes to the future of cooperation, and do you think the world would be a safer place if we would let artificial intelligence make really talk about difficult decisions for us? And which decisions could that be, possibly?
Walter.
So on the first one, how do we actually improve cooperation globally among people? There is this whole section on confidence building measures, and I think the example that you cite of North and South Korea is an interesting one, how they've tried to have family reunification, journalists, civil society coming together. We saw a lot of that in the 1970s and 80s as well between the West and the Soviet Union, these so-called Helsinki committees. I think we miss that today, that I don't see this current crisis as between the West and Russia. I think this is very much Putin's war. But how do you reach out to Russian people now beyond the internet? How do you have that kind of rapprochement at a very personal level, which relates to your second question, which is how at some point are we going to rebuild this system? That people say the European security architecture is weak. I would disagree. My colleague and I were talking about this at lunch, that NATO is stronger than it's been in decades. The EU is united, even Hungary now back in the fold. Look at what Putin has managed to do in the last 2 weeks. So those two factors, he's brought Turkey back towards the West. He's made Germany great again. I don't know if that's a good idea in the long term. He's started to wean the West off of Russia's energy. These are things that were not possible without this kind of external factor. Anyway, one thing which is demonstrated by this tit-for-tat computer program is start with cooperation. If the other side defects, defect back again. If he defects, defect back again. However, at some point, become forgiving. Otherwise, you have a race to the bottom. So be cooperative. See if that's reciprocated. And I think that point will have to come. Some kind of gesture, something showing that there won't be necessarily a punitive peace, because that can lead to a lot of grievance down the road. So how do you find that rapprochement? But we're not there, and we're not going to be there for a while. But rather than punishing the other side and putting them in their corner forever, how do you rebuild those kind of bridges at the society level, but also within the international system? The third was about artificial intelligence. This I found fascinating, and I would love to do a whole project about it, because some people say, if humans are kind of the problem because we're fallible, and I think it was Thucydides said that most wars start because of fear and a sense of grievance and emotion and so on. Our assumption, not least in political theory, is that you're dealing with rational actors. But a lot of these leaders get to the top because they have personalities that are very similar to psychopaths. So if you are not necessarily dealing with a rational actor, but he's in a position of power, what does that mean for all of our models of cooperation, which are supposed to be very logical? So what if you had machines which were very clever, that could look at a problem with a lot of big data, and then come up with a system for dealing with the migration crisis or global warming or whatever? And then we thought, wow, that makes a lot of sense. Let's let the computer take all our decisions. The problem is when you take humans out of the kind of command and control chain, if you had other powerful computers, and people have written about this, wouldn't they, since they've been programmed by human beings, start to be more clever than the other computers and try and maximize what they can do? And then you have this competition at a very sophisticated level where we're kind of sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, we're not part of this, but we've asked these machines to come up with the most clever outcomes. The other dangerous aspect, which is more immediate, is lethal automated weapon systems. That you have drones, for example, which are armed, where it's possible not even to have a human in the command and control chain. So this thing is programmed to look for a tank and destroy it, but then there's something else flying around that's supposed to be looking for a drone. This thing shoots the tank, that thing shoots the drone, and maybe there's some kind of other system which quickly escalates the situation where there's no human saying stop. So I think that could escalate things very quickly in a dangerous way. And there are scientists who are speaking out now against the dangers of potential robot wars. And these are the kinds of scenarios that I touch on briefly here. I think there's a lot in it to see what can be done with virtuous technology, but I'm not so keen about taking humans out of the equation completely because I'm not so sure that rational decisions are going to be operating in isolation because there are so many other human factors that are going to have to be taken into account.
Thank you, Walter. And then we can do another round of 3. Yes, 1.
Hi, thank you for your remarks about your book. And my question is about something you said. You said it shouldn't take war to reform the system, but all the experiences we had, and you also said that that substantial change was caused by war. So my question is it a precondition for change that we have a substantial crisis that we have now? And further, is unity and cooperation that is caused by a crisis like that, will it last, or is it only temporary? The unity and cooperation we have now within the West against that external threat. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to thank you for a very comprehensive look at the global security, and I have a question regarding use of unconventional, not traditional weapons like chemical or biological weapons, because till now we were talking only about conventional threats to global security. And in this regard, I have a question. Do you think that the society, countries should make some kind of reforms in the United Nations which should take more care over controlling activity of some countries in this field? Thank you.
Thank you. And then there was, then maybe Mathieu, then we're going to do the rest.
Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. I have a question that's actually related to the relationship between justice and cooperation. Do you think there's any relationship between justice and cooperation? I'm referring here to the fact that if, like, building on what's going on in Ukraine and on the arguments that were, or the words that were used by President Putin in order to threaten the West because of the invasion, and the West, we saw that the West could not intervene in Ukraine. And why? Because of the threat of nuclear weapons. And we see that that question is also quite relevant because some countries are trying or understood that this is the way to protect themselves from possible external aggression. And some countries like North Korea, Iran and so, they cannot go in that way because there are rules or there are kind of, there's an opposition from the international community that does not want them to develop their own weapons. Whereas we see that this is also a possible way to protect themselves, because this is a good argument also to threaten those who are as powerful as, or those who are more powerful. And do you think justice, in the sense that as states are equal, and states have the right to the same rights, like any, and now I'm referring to President Erdogan's word in during the General Assembly 2 years ago, where he was saying that there is no reason for one country to have nuclear weapons, and there's also no reason for other countries not to have the same rights. So do you think justice can also bring kind of that incentive to cooperation, where every state can have nuclear weapons, and then any state cannot, in this condition, aggress another one? I think this, yeah. Like justice can lead to cooperation.
No, justice is definitely an important bit of it. Walter.
I'm trying to imagine a world where every member state of the UN has a nuclear weapon so that we have mutually assured destruction and then we have peace. Not so sure, but that's the logical outcome of the argument of mutually assured destruction. But to answer your question in relation to your point, two things. One, justice and cooperation. I think it's important to have the caveat to talk about principled cooperation. Because as we talked about before, some of the people who cooperate best are not the role models that we want. Look at the Axis during the Second World War. That was a good example of cooperation. Look at criminal groups. But the type of cooperation that I'm talking about is something which is sustainable, something which enhances international peace and cooperation and security, not something which leads to instability. And that relates to your point of justice and what I would call principled cooperation. Whether having nuclear weapons is what can create a balance, that's possible, but I don't think that's necessarily the best way to promote cooperation. What's interesting, if you read the preamble to the Treaty on Nuclear Non-Proliferation, one thing it says is that parties to the treaty should not, it doesn't say this exactly, but shouldn't threaten other countries with the nuclear weapons that they have, which we saw the other day. But something that you alluded to, which relates to non-conventional weapons, is what was the lesson from the aggression against Ukraine in 2014, despite the fact that there was that Budapest Memorandum from 1994 that said when Ukraine gives up its nuclear weapons, okay, apparently the Russians had the code, so the Ukrainians couldn't have used it anyway, but when Ukraine and Kazakhstan gave up their nuclear weapons, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia was supposed to guarantee their security. One of the countries that was supposed to be the guarantor of security violates the security of Ukraine in 2014 with almost no consequences. So what you were saying, if I'm North Korea or Iran, why would I possibly want to give up my nuclear weapons when I can always point to the example of Ukraine? So that, I think, was a very bad precedent, which shows that where there's an injustice, the violation of that security guarantee, then you're building up problems in the future. Same thing on the use of chemical weapons in Syria. Was it in 2011, 2012? President Obama said if Assad uses chemical weapons against his own people, that's a red line for us. He uses chemical weapons, there are no consequences. I think the Russians took that as a sign of weakness, and then a year later march into Crimea. So I think the use of these weapons themselves are somehow supposed to be controlled by international mechanisms and institutions, including the OPCW in The Hague. But it's the violation of those conventions which is the biggest problem, a violation with no consequences. The problem that we see today, though, is this idea that there can't be a no-fly zone because this would start the Third World War, that NATO would have to fight the Russians because both sides have nuclear weapons. Is that the way that we want to go? Not so sure. Which gets back to the first question, what is it that can focus the minds of leaders short of war to actually change the system? And I would argue that you need some sense of urgency. And we had that with COVID, but I think we lost that opportunity already. Maybe now you see with the reforms in NATO and the EU that strong sense of urgency, but again, self-interest of those countries. What is it that's going to unite us as a planet? Perhaps climate change, but it seems like such a slow-moving thing that it's only young people who are looking to their future that are actually trying to do something. How do you get people to change? And I think that's all about narratives. It's all about using communication tools, getting people to understand that they have an interest to do something. And this is what we try and do with our work against corruption and organized crime. Getting people to think about the impact of things and how they have to do something. And compared to 3 weeks ago when everybody was thinking, well, there's not going to be a war, to now when hundreds of thousands of people are marching in the streets, showing solidarity with Ukraine, trying to do things. I think this is this Wende. Something is changing, and that, I think, is what scares Putin the most.
Thank you. Then we have time for, and I think there are more questions from the floor here. Don't even know where to start. It's easiest for you, Melazine.
Hello, thank you so much as well from me. My question would be, I'm curious how you would assess kind of differences between EU enlargement and NATO enlargement, and whether you think maybe cooperation on a military or intelligence level should be assessed differently from, say, economic integration or freedom of movement, working together on ideas and values, if you make any distinguishments through those.
Thank you. And then I think there were a couple of hands up in the back for Tini, I think. Yeah. Oh, sorry, and Maximilian. So whoever goes gonna go first.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I mean, you also mentioned it in your speech, but many have said that the OSCE has been going through an existential crisis since the moment it was created as a conference and then turned into some kind of an organization. And given your argument that there is a wind of change, let's say, or at least a momentum of change after the current developments, what would the future be for the OSCE if not reformed? Because to be honest, like in my view, I don't see a reform being made for the OSCE given the past 10-year efforts to do so and many proposals. But so what would the future be if, again, not reformed? Thank you.
Thank you. And Maximilian, yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Maximilian. My question would be, it's kind of similar to one that has already been raised, but how likely would you consider that the current war in Ukraine gives the impetus for the EU to cooperate more tightly on a military level? Because the military cooperation has been quite weak, as I understand now.
Thank you. And Walter, you have the word again.
So the difference between EU enlargement and NATO enlargement, I think you more or less answered the question in your question, that the EU is dealing with economic union, to some extent increasingly political union, whereas NATO is more of a military defensive alliance. The Russian argument is, well, if it's a defensive alliance, why does it keep advancing towards us? And it's interesting, if you see the narrative of the Russians and NATO countries, it's very similar. The feeling of being encircled, the feeling of a lack of trust. It's also interesting that there's been much less military-to-military dialogue between Russia and the West in the last 10 years than during the Cold War. And that creates distance between the sides and distrust and so on. So I think now, when you see the argument about the future of Ukraine, I think even the Ukrainian leadership realizes now that the promise of being in NATO was a pretty empty promise and actually caused them greater insecurity than stability, and that it makes more sense for them not to rely on being a NATO member, at least in the near future. but they would need some kind of different security guarantee. But being in the EU is more of an economic issue. Is it also a community of values? This has been called into doubt by the behavior of Poland and Hungary and others. But are these clubs somehow exclusive from others? This is where I think the EU and NATO could have done more in the last 20 years to also reach out and say to countries like Ukraine, if you have a close relationship to EU, it's not all or nothing. You can also have a close relation to Russia or the Eurasian Economic Union and so on. You don't necessarily have to make this choice because of your geography. You need good relations with both. But I personally could easily imagine Ukraine in the EU and not in NATO. But it's interesting to see how countries that are in the EU and not in NATO, like Finland, Sweden, and Austria, are having second thoughts about whether they should actually join NATO and not be neutral. The future of the OSCE, it's something that I think about because I have worked in the OSCE and I'm a big fan. I see three possibilities. One, it staggers on and has meetings and is more or less useless. Number two is that it dies, collapses because it's irrelevant. Number three, which is what I hope for, but I'm an optimist, and that is that people realize that there will have to be a place where Russia can talk to the West, where countries that are not in the EU or NATO and are not going to be anytime soon, like the Western Balkans, Southern Caucasus, Central Asia, etc., Ukraine, are going to have to talk about security issues, but in a very light structure, more like the CSCE, a conference, than OSCE with a lot of institutions. That's how I imagine it would go, but people are going to have a little bit of imagination. I think the fact that Finland might be the chair in 2025, on the 50th anniversary of the Helsinki Final Act, they might have an interest in the next few years to have some kind of security dialogue process. But it will all be about managing expectations. The consultations that led up to the Helsinki Final Act took 3 years. The time between the first discussions of Reagan and Gorbachev in Geneva in 1986 and the outcome in 1990 was like 4 years. So there's going to have to be a ceasefire, there's going to have to be de-escalation, some kind of resolution of the conflict in Ukraine, and I think part of the deal would be to have a broader discussion, but over several years, on restructuring the European security architecture. But it's very hard to live with Russia, but you can't live without them either. So you have to find a way to have them in the fold. I can't read my own writing. Military cooperation? EU. Does this increase the likelihood of greater cooperation, a kind of EU army? I think that will depend on who the next president of the United States is. At the moment, it was quite telling. Remember, a year or two ago when Merkel came back from a meeting with Trump and said, we can't rely on the United States anymore. At the moment, Europe can rely on the United States, but depending on who the next president is, then maybe again this talk about a European army. A lot will remain to be seen what happens in the war in Ukraine. But we can't end on that note. We need a different question.
No, we'll do another round.
There
were more hands up, and we'll try to end up on a more positive note.
Hello. Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. Now the pressure's on for a positive note. Unfortunately, I don't think this will be my question. We've talked about that cooperation highly depends on the context of it, and concerning artificial intelligence and the digital age. How must cooperation adapt to the new conflicts that arise in cyberspace? Is it just confidence building? Is it the establishment of an international regime? Or is it something else, and how likely are those? Thank you.
Thank you. And are there any more hands up? Yes? Nada.
Thank you. My name is Nada. Thank you for your presentation. I have a question regarding the main powers and the international community, like the same what's happening nowadays during regarding Ukraine crisis. why such actions is not taken in other crises like what are taking place now in Yemen and the embargo and what's taking place now in Syria.
Thank you. And then we would have room for one more question. If there's no one else, then I'm going to give it to Miriam. She has asked already a question, but that's okay. To Miriam.
I'll try to make it possible.
Okay, good.
So, because you said that there's no need to choose for certain countries like Ukraine because of their geographic location, could you maybe elaborate on a very nice scenario where, for example, countries like Ukraine or Serbia, because that's also very relevant today, and don't have to choose, and where there's a good cooperation and trust between the EU and Russia in terms that we don't have to either physically in or exclude certain countries, but we just accept that we're all at peace and cooperation together. Thank you.
Thanks, Miriam. Walter.
The last one was a good setup. I'll see what I can do to end on a positive note. The first two are not so positive. So, cyber. It's interesting now a discussion has started on a UN cyber treaty. And even at the low point of discussions between Russia and the United States, apparently one thing they could agree on was the need to not have kind of state-sponsored cyber attacks on each other's infrastructure. Remember when some major pipeline in the United States was blocked and there was ransomware and so on? I don't know enough about that, but I think Biden in his meeting with Putin last June said, we need some kind of understanding that we're not going to do these things to each other because of this idea of tit for tat. You shut down my infrastructure, I'm going to shut down your infrastructure. And I think there will be some kind of understanding of the self-interest in not doing this at a state level. It's different through hackers and so on. And this is where it gets messy because you can use third parties to do things when you have deniability and so on. But this also relates to the importance of cooperation between governments and the private sector. That because a lot of this is going on through servers and things which are controlled by private companies, you can have the best international treaty, but you won't be able to implement it unless you also have this broader set of actors. So I think it's much more complex than before, which is also why I think you need more than diplomats around tables in places like the Vienna International Center. You need different experts with different skills to understand these kind of things, or drug policy, or climate change, whatever it may be. And our argument is that you also need civil society, that you need to involve people in these decisions. Why do people care more about a crisis in somewhere like Ukraine than in Yemen or Syria? I think it's partly to do with proximity. So this conflict is close to us, and it's something that we can relate to. I think it's also to do with attention spans. There were reports a few weeks ago that there were about 1,000 ceasefire violations in the Donbass. And journalists were there and they were saying, you know, there are 1,000 explosions today. In 2017, there were 8,000 or 9,000 explosions every day, but nobody was paying attention. And that crisis in Ukraine went on longer than the Second World War, from 2014 to 2021, before it blew up this year. But nobody was paying attention until now. So the bad kids get the cookies. People are watching what the immediate crisis is. And people have forgotten about these other conflicts. And sometimes they're in faraway places compared to where the media is interested. This one is also slightly different because you have one of the most powerful countries in the world with nuclear weapons, and people are paying attention. What is a good case scenario for having countries living in peace and harmony? I think there are good examples of countries that can have a good relationship with the EU and with Russia and its neighborhood. I was going to say Armenia and Kazakhstan, but in the last couple of years, those examples have not been particularly good. But I think it's a false choice to say you're either with us in one block or you're not. And that was the hope of the early 1990s, that you would have no more barriers and so on. Again, I think we will see a pendulum swing back towards more cooperation, back towards more integration, maybe deglobalization, but enough bonds between us because we have grown up, particularly your generation, seeing that this can work and that we're connected through our phones, through the way that we can travel and talk to each other and so on. It's not going to be possible to build walls, whether it's firewalls or physical walls or whatever. People are going to get around them. And we can't go back to the other extreme where everything was open. But there will, I think, be some kind of balance which is found based on functionalism, again, based on self-interest, that we are now interconnected in ways that are only going to continue, for better or for worse. And therefore, to conclude, I think we need security through cooperation.
See, that worked very well as a conclusion. Walter, thanks very, very much. And thanks to the Austrian Research Foundation, there's always a reception afterwards. So give the people in charge of it 5 minutes or so to stay here or wait outside, whatever you want.
Did I mention there are books for sale?
And then, yes,
oh, okay.
Actually, first go and get the book if you want to. And and then we meet over there, and then we can informally continue the discussion a little bit. Thanks a lot for being here.